Okay, good morning. Okay, glad you all are here. Before we get started with the panel, I just want to say that I thought that the presentations yesterday were sensational, and I think it's very difficult to go off in the field for a few weeks or sometimes longer, maybe even months, to work on a project for several months, and then to come here and say everything you said in 10 minutes. That is a skill and a talent that will serve you well, and I was very impressed with that. I also think from your stories that you told yesterday, you have developed a lot of flexibility, or you always had it, and that's another great trait of a journalist. And now I'm going to turn this over to Catherine, and we'll start the first panel.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Catherine, and I'm Associate Editor here at the Pulitzer Center. I'm here to introduce our four lovely panelists this morning who are all prior Pulitzer Center grantees. We have Allison Shelley, who's a documentary photographer and multimedia journalist who has been based in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and was for over a year after the 2010 quake, and has been reported from a number of other countries, including India, Nepal, Nigeria, Cuba, Ethiopia, Congo, Mexico, Mongolia, and the Philippines. She's been commissioned by publications such as The New Yorker, National Geographic, The New York Times, The Guardian, among others, and is co-director of Women Photojournalists of Washington. We also have Sarah Weiser, who's a photojournalist and reporter based in New York, currently working for Retro Reports, before which she worked for newspapers in Washington, Illinois, and in Utah. She reported from India in late 2014 for her project with Retro Report, which was a look back at the legacy of the population bomb. Emily Feldman is an Istanbul-based journalist who writes about the humanitarian crises resulting from conflict in Iraq and Syria. She has a special focus on women. She's looked at the horrors suffered by ethnic Yazidis last summer at the hands of Islamic State fighters. Visual media producer David Rochkind is a full-time Pulitzer Center grantee and has worked for a diverse range of publications and clients, including the New York Times, Times Magazine, Time, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, the Cholera Center, UNHCR, and the World Health Organization. So I guess we'll start with Allison, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your work.
She's just going to show some of the pictures I've done for Pulitzer. I've done 4 projects through Pulitzer Center in different countries, working on a lot of maternal health issues is my main focus. In the course of doing this work, I work with a lot of different people, a lot of different sources, and what I'd like to talk about today is working with NGOs. So we'll get very specific. Who here has had to work with or has worked with an NGO in order to get reporting done in the field? Great. Okay. So this is something we're all dealing with. NGOs can be your biggest asset, but it's also your biggest liability when you're working in the field. And this is a question I get asked a lot, like how, what are the ethical lines working with NGOs? So I thought we'd just talk a little bit about that. NGOs can be a great help connecting you with your story, but they most often represent a specific interest, right? So we know the purpose of non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, is to espouse a certain, line or political viewpoint, promote a particular course of action, protect a certain people group, focus on one aspect of a larger issue. That means that they're coming at whatever your topic is from one side in general. And who can tell me why that's a problem? Bias, yeah. Has anyone experienced that in the field? Has anyone found themselves in a corner because of that? Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, do you want me to stand up?
Sure.
So I was doing some reporting when I was in Iraq, and I was in the Kurdistan area, and I ended up going into some refugee camps with people from the PKK, and so it was really, and it was like a nonprofit that worked with the PKK, and my reporting obviously was impacted by it because people thought that I was in alliance with the PKK.
And did you do anything while you were in the field to sort of like
Yeah.
counter
I had
that?
to.
What did you do?
I essentially just got like I got another nonprofit that kind of balanced out. Like mostly like I included that voice in my reporting, and then like I went
Great.
out with that nonprofit like 2 days later. But like, yeah.
Great. And that's a great way to do it. Sort of find the other side, right? Do it. Somebody else had their hand up over here. Anybody else want to talk about that? Okay, cool. So that's a great example of why you should never rely on an NGO for your sole source of information. I always seek out officials, opposition groups, local organizations, activists who also might espouse just one side of an issue, but also will help you circle around your truth a little bit more. Sometimes an NGO is your only way into an issue. When I was living in Haiti, it was the time when cholera happened for the first time in 100 years. Cholera came to Haiti. And you were going to the neighborhoods, you were seeing people that had it, but to see people being treated, you had to go into a cholera treatment center. And to get into those, you had to go through one of the organizations that was dealing with that. One of the big ones was a group called Samaritan's Purse. And they had very specific guidelines about what you could do when you were in those centers, who you could talk to, and they would not let you see the people who were in the final stages. So they were trying to show you a very particular part of how cholera is treated, what their organization was doing, that they were saving people. They didn't want you to see the people who were not making it. And that was a problem for me. So, you spend your days in there, you say, thank you very much. And then you try to circle around the issue another way. And for us, that meant going into the neighborhood, talking to people. And we had a lot of trouble finding, pictures that could show what does cholera do to a person in the final stages. So sometimes you have to be very creative. But you always have to be asking yourself those questions. Sometimes an NGO is your only way to a location where something is happening. Last year I was in DR Congo reporting a story on what it's like to be pregnant in a conflict zone. And there was a particular part of Eastern Congo called North Kivu. Probably a lot of you guys have been reading about things happening there. The conflict is still happening in the hills there. And there are some little towns way out in the middle of nowhere where it's particularly bad. And it's so bad that every other organization is gone from there. The government's, support is very minimal. And the roads also to get out there have not been maintained for those reasons. So the only way out there, the only group that was working out there was MSF, Doctors Without Borders. And the only way they were getting out there was by motorcycle convoy. And they had a particular line every morning. This was incredible to me, but every morning, the leader of that particular organization would get radio calls from all the different rebel groups in the area. And they would tell them where they were, what their movements were going to be for that day, and what village they were going to attack. And in return, MSF provided, medical care to all of their wounded fighters. So that was their deal. So they were the only way in. And so they basically took us by motorcycle into like 5 hours each direction into these small villages where literally you're climbing across rope bridges to get to the village. And at that point, you are completely under the care of an organization. And you need to be aware of that kind of thing when that happens. What are they giving you? How are they supporting you? And what are you giving them in return? And that's really important. What are you giving them in return? MSF, when I first started working for them, asked me to just provide them with some of my photos, just that. And I said no, because I wanted the discretion to be able to control those pictures. And ultimately, I did give them a handful of pictures for each place I went. But I didn't want that to be a blanket agreement. And that's an important point. You have control over that deal. So when you go into a place like that, you may be like, oh, this is great. We're getting into this remote village. We're doing these things. But what are you giving up? Those are questions that you really need to ask yourself. And what is that deal? Make that deal. You've got the power to be able to lay that out any way you like, respecting what they're giving you. An important part of that is how do you deal with what they are giving you? I always pay my way, right? And no more. And that's the next important point. if you are being taken somewhere, if they are taking you by motorcycle somewhere, they're putting you up overnight, which they did for us for 3 or 4 nights. They are feeding you. You need to find out what that cost is and reimburse it. That's what we did, and it was, it was very cheap, but that's something that we felt was very important. We don't want to owe this organization anything. We want to pay our way. We want to be able to give them that. But what happens when you give them more? If they ask you, oh, can you just, bring us these supplies, do this thing for us? Then you start getting into the territory of, you're a journalist. You need to think about what it is you're there for, and not paying any more than what your due is. And that's a tricky line. That's a much longer conversation. So the last point I have here is beware of conflicts of interest. This is a particular point for, I think, photographers like myself. I've gotten calls from organizations that have brought me into the field to then later do work for them. We liked your work. You did a great job on that story. Can we hire you to come, fly out here and shoot for us? And the answer for me is always no. And you need to find out the answer for yourself. What are your ethical lines? Where's your, what is your ethical line as far as like what you will then do in the future? I do work for NGOs, but I never work for NGOs that work in the field that I work in, which is mental health. And I never do paid work for groups that I've been taken into the field, from. And that's that can be a problem if you do get a lot of your income from that kind of work. You need to think about that kind of thing. And then I guess there was one more point. Be clear about what NGOs have given you when you publish. So I find one of my ethical lines is when the story comes out, when you finally, publishing that story, I try to be very clear about this organization helped us get into the field. They gave us this support, so that the reader is clear that there was an NGO helping us along the way. And they can make their own choices about how they perceive that, but that is all above board so that later it doesn't come back and somebody's like, well, you're biased on this side or that side or whatever. So those are my main points. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So you say you do some work directly for NGOs that aren't related to your stuff.
Yeah.
So that's just for them. You don't do that work for your own journalistic interest, maybe try and get something published.
Yeah, I separate those two things. And some people even have a problem with that. They would not do even that. I think writers have a different line with that. I think it's a little trickier for writers. The writer that I normally work with on these stories doesn't do any NGO work because it's perceived slightly differently. But photographers, for some reason, there seems to be an okay
So many
thing.
great projects are being funded by you.
Right, and that's fine. I think I have problems with that, and I have been approached by several groups that are like, we will bring you here to do this story, and I won't take that money. I won't do those trips just because I feel like that's a conflict of interest for me.
Right.
Allison, if you're shooting for a publication, newspaper, magazines, or you're selling them something that you've already shot, how often do the editors ask you about this? So you've got a nice personal ethical line.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, do they hold you accountable to that when they find your stuff?
I have never had an editor ask me about that.
So it's right here for you.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a newspaper photographer for many years, and we had a pretty strong, we designed things at most of the papers I worked for that said, here's my ethical line. So it's just something that's sort of always been in my head. Like, you don't cross, you don't take gifts from your subjects. You don't give them certain, So yeah, I want to be, there's credibility at stake here. We're journalists. For me, that's the most important thing. Where is my credibility coming from? If I'm seen to have a partiality to a group, then I may be perceived differently as a journalist. I may not be perceived as a journalist.
Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience?
I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics in the field. And the reporting that I recently did for the Pulitzer Center with the Yazidis made me think about this quite a bit, because this is, well, first I'll just back up a little bit and tell you just briefly what this topic is. The Yazidis are a religious minority in Iraq, and they were targeted by ISIS when ISIS pushed into Iraq in the summer of 2014 and made headlines all around the world for what was done to them. Many were killed, and most shockingly, a lot of them were kidnapped and enslaved and remain enslaved. This was a sensational story that a lot of newspapers wanted to send people out there to get these very sensational headlines, which are very easy to do, very available. And I actually just Googled this morning Yazidi, and I checked Google News, and here are some of these sensational headlines that are continuing to come in. I was a blue-eyed Yazidi teenager describes ISIS sex slave market, which that headline alone should raise some flags. This is a teenager who spoke to, not the Daily Mail, it was the AFP actually, about being a sex slave. And these are standards that would not fly in the US if we're talking about a teenage victim of rape, but for some reason, these rules have kind of like gone out the window for this topic. People are so interested in getting these stories. So I was already kind of concerned about this as I was going on my trip, and then this story was published in the Daily Beast, which made me think about it even more. It's a really good story, and I want to read you just like a little piece of it so you get a sense of what this is. The deck is, the public's interest in knowing explicit details of sexual violence must not outweigh these victims' urgent need for safety and privacy. And I'll just read you the lead because it's powerful. It has been more than 50 years since a British journalist who came across a group of Belgian nuns in war-ravaged Congo was heard to shout, "Anyone here been raped and speaks English?" But the callousness of that line, made infamous as the title of a book by veteran correspondent Edward Baer, remains with us today. If anything, the cynicism and exploitation of the victims may be worse. So I read this article, which comes out the day that I get on the plane to go report on this, and now I'm like having a crisis and hoping that I don't fall into traps and wind up harming people. So I decide while I'm on the plane, I have to make rules for myself. I can't be on the ground deciding what my rules are going to be. So I decide that the world already knows basically what has happened to these women. So many of these stories have come out. NGOs, ISIS itself published a lengthy article explaining what they were doing to these women. So is there news value in going back and asking these women to tell their stories again and again and again? And I decide, no, there is no news value. The next step is looking forward. What sort of treatment are these women getting? What is their future? How are they getting out of ISIS captivity? So that has to be my focus. And if along the way it is relevant, I can, on a case-by-case basis, decide whether I'm going to even go there. But it's once you're actually out there, you could think that it's quite easy to keep this morality, but there are sometimes moments where you're tempted to break your own rules. And I'll just tell you a quick story of when I had a little bit of a conflict, because a very cool thing happened, like journalistically cool. I kept on speaking to these women and asking them about what happened, like, is anyone getting psychological treatment? Where are they going? And they're like, oh, Dr. Mirza saving them. And I'm like, who's Dr. Mirza? And no one can explain to me who this like mysterious man was. But I kept hearing, he's taking us all to Germany. And I'm like, what? Who is this person? Who is Dr. Mirza? So finally I find the phone number for Dr. Mirza, and my translator is calling him. He's not answering the phone. Finally he answers the phone and he says, oh yes, actually I have 2 buses of women, there are 80 of them, and I'm taking them to be blessed by the high priest and say goodbye to their families because I'm getting them on a plane to Germany. Would you like to come along for the ride? And I'm like, oh my God. So I'm like, so excited about this, and we take off, and then here I am just dumped with 80 women who are held as sex slaves, and a lot of them are children or teenagers. And now I have my camera with me, and I had told myself there's no reason to photograph anyone, there's no reason to show the face of these people. I have to at least explain to them who I am and what I'm doing. And yet here I am at this scene of like, my God, I'm in like a Harry Potter temple and like families are saying goodbye and they're crying and they're about to be whisked off to Germany. And so this was a challenge, and I told myself, okay, I should take the pictures and I could decide what to do with them later. And I go into like paparazzi mode. And then a man who's working for an NGO who was sort of facilitating this whole thing snaps me out of it, because he comes and screams in my face, basically, "What are you doing? Who are you?" And then I felt like I crumbled and felt really conflicted and bad about it. I talked to him and I explained that obviously I'm not throwing this up on, like, I'm not live tweeting this, and I'm conscious of the ethical concerns that he had. And in the end, the photos were amazing, and I wound up not using them, which was a tough thing, but I kept going back to that Daily Beast article and trying to think about, what the right thing to do was. And basically, I think it doesn't matter if you're reporting on rape or you're reporting on, someone who's being evicted from their home. Like, no one has the obligation to speak to you ever, and you can't forget that. I think it's really important to remember that anyone who speaks to you is doing it not because they have to, and that even if they're not aware of the risks that they're putting themselves in, you have to be. Like, someone might be willing to, yeah, you could take a picture of me, I'll tell you my whole story, like, put it on YouTube, doesn't matter. Like, you are the responsible person in the end, and if they're not willing to think about their safety, you have to. It's a big responsibility, but we can't forget our humanity for the sake of a story. And it's important, like, my conclusion was, like, you have to think about these people as your family members, like your brothers and sisters, and if you wouldn't want your brother and sister to be treated this way, then you cannot do it. Like, a story is never going to be worth it.
Sarah?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I thought I would just tell you guys a little bit about my experience working in India for a story that I did recently for the Pulitzer Center. I work at Retro Report, a nonprofit documentary news organization. I was working with my colleague Kit Rohn, and we wanted to tell the story about the 1960s fear over the population bomb. There were a lot of scary predictions at the time about what would happen if we didn't control our growing population. And I thought that India, with its history, its kind of complicated and controversial history of population control, would be a good place for us to tell this story. So today I thought I would just touch on basically three main points, maybe three or four. The first, and this might be kind of obvious, but I think it's really the importance of pre-reporting and preparation. I was only in the field for a limited amount of time, which I'm sure is probably the case with a lot of you guys. And I think some of that early work is really, really important. And so I basically started by doing a ton of reading, reports, articles, stories. I also found that local coverage, going to, the Indian press and seeing how they covered some of these issues was really important and kind of gave a different perspective that we don't get here. And I talked to as many people as I could. So, professors at Indian universities, doctors in the field, health activists, NGOs, which are great help, but yeah, just something to remember, which we've already kind of spoken about up here, but they do have their own agenda, and so it's good to be aware of what they're doing when you're working with them. So yeah, this is a ton of information, kind of bringing it all together. My goal is really to tell a human story. How do I boil all this down into something that's personal? What really does affect women's decisions about family size, and how do I avoid making the story reductive? Because I think, women's experiences vary so much, not just across India, but even within the same city or the same village. And so I ended up planning the trip around two different regions of the country, Bihar in the north, which has a much higher fertility rate, and Tamil Nadu in the south, which has a much lower fertility rate and also higher levels of literacy and better access to healthcare more broadly. And so also in advance, finding a good fixer, which I'm sure is another thing you guys have used yourselves is really, really helpful. And especially not speaking the language. The guy I was working with was really great in some of the connecting me to early people at the beginning who I wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise. So you do all this prep work, but then when you get to the field, inevitably things fall through. And so my second point is really about being adaptable on the ground and kind of taking advantage when things kind of go differently than you expect. With the help of a local NGO, I had been connected to a women's health activist in a remote area of Bihar, and I had set up a visit to a sterilization camp. I learned when it was going to be happening, and we kind of planned that leg of our trip around it. But when I got to the region, I learned it had been postponed. And we're in this remote area. We had only really dedicated a day to this part of the trip, and so we started scrambling. We were calling all our contacts. We showed up at a local community health center and hoping the head doctor there might have some ideas. He didn't, but he turned out to be one of the best interviews that I had had. And he really challenged some of the ideas that I think some people in the West might have about the family planning program in India. And he talked about really the problems of healthcare in remote areas, saying that sterilization targets, which is a big thing in the family planning program, are not necessarily themselves the problem. And neither necessarily are sterilization camps. It's really just the lack of investment, in his opinion, in the broader healthcare system that really leaves both women and doctors with very little options on the ground. So I also had another interview fall through too with a top health official in the state government, and I had done all the prep work. I had planned it ahead of time. We got there early. We set up the lights for the interview, and then he ended up bailing and refusing to sit for the interview. But it's too bad. But I ended up using the time to reconnect with a woman I had met at an earlier at a family planning clinic a few days earlier. And so it was really great to be able to use that time to go home with her and get to know her family and see her at home. You never really know what'll happen when things go off script and who you'll meet. And that's part of the exciting thing about being in the field. We did find a sterilization camp that day, and I met Lakshmi there. She's an ASHA, or local community health activist. And she, some critics of the family planning program point to the fact that there are these sterilization targets for all healthcare workers, including ASHAs, and also that there's these monetary incentives in place for the procedure. But Lakshmi saw things differently. And she offered to introduce us to a woman from her village that she had brought recently to be sterilized just a couple days before. And so we hopped in the car, squeezed in the back seat, bumping along the road back towards her village. And she was just describing how, she really thinks small families are the best in the interest of women because it allows them to better provide for the children they have and can also have some time to focus on themselves as well. We found Sonia, Lakshmi, the woman that Lakshmi had brought, outside of her home with her newborn. She had 4 children, and she had gotten sterilized, willingly gone for sterilization a couple days before, after hearing about it from Lakshmi, the ASHA. And but as I was talking with her, I realized that she didn't realize there are other forms of birth control available. And so it just, she really helped to kind of give me yet another perspective, I guess, on this topic and really give some depth to the coverage and to the story. The last thing I thought I'd mention is something that I think we're all probably experiencing to some degree, and that's taking on multiple roles in the field and being responsible for bringing back different kinds of content. I'm a photographer, and I have begun shooting a little bit of video, but here in India, I was also working as a producer. We had hired a local shooter, and I was constantly trying to, stay aware of what I was shooting and what he was shooting, and also keeping in mind what the broader story needed. In stills, in video, in audio, and also not just what we needed thematically, but the technical elements too. Like, were we getting enough B-roll of a particular city to be able to establish within the documentary that that, where we were at that point. Or, like a tight shot of a doctor with a patient and their hands, during an examination. It was also the first time, and this was kind of a challenge for me, working with another shooter in such intimate settings, exam rooms or operating rooms, or one room home, with both of us, 2 people, 2 cameras, a lot of gear, sometimes audio tripods, audio gear. I realized how overwhelming our presence could be. And I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind too, and be aware of your own presence in the scene. I wanted to close by just saying what may be the obvious, and that's sometimes if you stick around long enough, and maybe not even necessarily shooting the whole time or, reporting the whole time, you'll get lucky. I remember it was at the end of a very long day, the last day of the trip. We were at a small hospital outside of Chennai. I had sent the guys I was working with away to go get food because, they were getting a little bit antsy. But I found myself reluctant to call it a day because, I don't know, I constantly found myself feeling that way throughout the trip. And I was there, and one of the nurses came over to me and said that a woman was about to give birth, and so I was able to get permission from the woman and get be there as that happened, and that was really great. And I think so in some sense it was lucky, in a way, right place, right time. But I also think I like to think that good preparation and hard work and hustle really kind of creates that situation where you'll actually be able to have that kind of luck. So, thank you.
David?
So, much of my work, and this is on automatic? No? Okay. So, much of my work over the past several years has been on public health and specifically tuberculosis. And every time I start working on a story, I'm pretty much sure it's going to fail. It doesn't make any sense to me that I'll travel to a place where I don't speak the language, show up in front of complete strangers with a camera, sometimes at their homes, and ask them to allow me to not only talk to them, but also to take their pictures in what must be one of the most difficult and vulnerable times of their lives. But every time I'm amazed at the openness and graciousness and generosity of people who are willing to share those stories with me and who are willing to let me in. And I kind of imagine what my response would be if I answered the door and I saw someone with a camera speaking language that I didn't understand, and they were asking to come in to take my picture or to take the picture of a family member, my mother or my father, as we were battling a really debilitating disease. And I just can't imagine that I'd be as welcoming as the scores of people that I've met over the years working on these stories about tuberculosis and public health. And I think it's important to remember that when we work on stories about crisis or conflict or public health, that we're meeting people at a time when they're incredibly vulnerable and sometimes they're desperate. And this creates a situation where people can easily be taken advantage of, and they can easily be taken advantage of by us, even if it's not what we intend to do, and even if we don't realize that we're doing it. When we work on public health stories in the developing world, we often come into contact with people, with potential subjects, through an intermediary that they trust. It might be a doctor, or it might be an NGO, or it might be some other kind of healthcare professional. And in journalism, we talk a lot about building relationships, and especially in photojournalism, we talk about that, the importance of building relationships and building trust. But the reality is that, again, especially in photojournalism, we're often trading on the trust that's already been built between the subject we encounter and the person who introduced us to that subject. And I think that this can often give us a false sense of access or a false sense of agreement from the subject to participate in whatever it is the story that we're working on. And, as was mentioned in one of the questions earlier, it's important to remember that when we're working, we're essentially on our own. There isn't anyone looking over our shoulders. There isn't anyone making sure that we do things correctly or making sure that we treat people with respect. We're interacting with people who are in incredibly vulnerable situations, who often see us in positions of power due to how that relationship was introduced or to other factors in play, depending on where we're reporting from. And in my experience, when you work in resource-poor settings covering issues that affect vulnerable populations, there are moments where you can easily take advantage of people. There are moments where, without lying, it can be easy to bend the truth or omit certain facts in order to get the access you want or the information you think you need or build that relationship with the subject. So here I also wanted to raise the issue of ethics and how we treat people in the field and how we treat the characters in our stories. I think it's especially important in photojournalism when we often think that we have to find the most dramatic moment possible in order to visually represent an issue that on its own is already heartbreaking. And that puts us in a position where we can feel like we're hunting for drama, or we're hunting for death, or we're hunting for sadness. And in that process, we can start treating people like props. Instead of looking for subjects that help tell a story, for example, a story about how technology affects TB diagnosis, we end up only looking for subjects that best tell the story about how TB kills people. And where was I? Right, so in that idea of only looking for subjects that kind of visually represent this idea, I've worked with NGOs who have told me that some photojournalists come to them and all they ask is, take me to the people who are closest to death, or take me to the people who are sickest. That's what I want to see. And they sort of gloss over the rest of the story. And when you're so driven to find and document that kind of drama, it can be easy to overlook the actual people that you're meeting. It can be easy to under-explain what you're working on in hopes that they'll let you in. It can be easy to let a doctor explain for you in a language that you don't understand what you're doing, and sort of just conveniently forget that you don't know what's been explained to the subject and just assume that it's been explained correctly. And it can be easy to tell someone that you hope the result of your story is that their situation might change, when in reality you know that that almost never happens. So I think it's really important to remember and to talk about out loud that in our drive to produce the best journalism possible, we do have to remember to treat people honestly. We do have to remember to treat people with respect, even in those instances when no one would ever know if we didn't. That we don't treat people like props or widgets that we plug in to fill a hole in our story. We don't ask them to go through uncomfortable or difficult experiences for no reason. And we don't push them beyond what seems acceptable, even if they keep saying yes. That we're always open and honest about who we are, what our role is, and what kind of expectations someone should have as a result of collaborating with us. So I'll leave it there for now, but I hope that in the Q&A we can talk a bit more about some of these issues and how they relate to thinking about perpetuating stereotypes and being culturally sensitive.
Thank you. So I have a question for the panel generally. How do you go about finding subjects, either from a distance or on the ground?
I think it happens in a variety of ways. Sometimes through organizations, which I'm sure you guys experienced when you were out in the field. Other times through fixers who have their own network of contacts, and sometimes through relationships that you may have been able to build on your own. So, for example, if you've been focusing on a particular topic for a certain amount of time, you start to develop a network of people that you can tap into, and they can get you in touch with people. But I think the most important thing is to be persistent, especially when you're just dropped into the field. You have to start asking everybody that you know. You have to bother everybody that you know, and cast a really wide net to try to find, because I think as others have said, you have to prepare for things to fall through. And even if you feel like you do have the character that you're looking for, if you have the interview set up that you need, you should always be extra cautious and cast that wide net to be sure that in case it does fall through, you have some sort of backup. So I think be persistent and ask everybody that you know, because you'll be surprised sometimes where contacts will come from if you are just chatting with someone at the hotel you're staying at and asking, who do you know? And by the way, do you know someone who? I think that after every interview, when you're finished with the interview, you should ask that person, who else do you know? Or by the way,
I'm looking for some people who blah, blah, blah. Do you know anybody? And sometimes we can pull a cell phone out and just start taking phone calls right there. So ask as many people and be as persistent as possible, I think.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's kind of like a game of dominoes. Once you talk to somebody, they have 3 people, you talk to each of them, they all have 3 more suggestions. So you are able to kind of follow all your different leads and find the best person. But I do feel like a lot of the people I really enjoyed and learned a lot from in the field were people that I didn't know ahead of time. It was people I came across through the reporting on the ground, talking with a doctor who would introduce me to one of her patients, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would be really open and talk to as many people as you can, because you'll find contacts everywhere.
I feel like it's been covered.
Hi, everyone. I have a question about ethics in regards to kind of navigating other cultures where like there's a sense of hospitality, especially around like people who they believe to be, like command respect often as like Westerners do when you go to these foreign countries. So I was just wondering if you could talk about kind of navigating like the line between like acceptable hospitality and like when you're starting to kind of cross a line with like accepting things from your subjects.
Like taking gifts or?
Yeah, maybe not even taking gifts, but like meals with people, celebrating holidays, and then like, how you kind of, it's a little nuanced, but I kind of ran into that when I was abroad, so.
How did you see it?
Well, I would go to a subject's house and then it just would happen to be dinner time and then you like sit down and eat with them. And in my mind, I was like, well, this is just being, a pleasant and hospitable person. But then at the same time, it's like they're feeding me and they're sheltering me for a small amount of time. And like, there was a holiday while I was there that I spent with, people that I had been interviewing. So I just wanted to know if you guys have run into that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too, right? Because all these lines that we make so neatly before we leave are very blurry in the field, right? And you do come in, having to have all your needs met in a place where you don't necessarily have any resource other than money. So sometimes it happens that you're in a place and that happens. I mean, in general, my role is like to try to provide what I'm getting back to whoever is giving it to me. So if I show up somewhere and somebody feeds me a feast and, and my crew or the people I'm, my fixer, my writer I'm working with or whatever, ideally I would love to then the next day be able to bring in, go to the market and bring food. And I've done that, I brought food in. I also personally travel with little gifts and they're not anything worth money, but like what I found to be, this is hilarious, but what I found to be the most popular thing in several different cultures that I've been to are snow globes with the Washington Monument in them. And I think it's because, a lot of people have never seen a snow globe. It's kind of interesting, right? So I travel with little stupid things like that are like, when someone does give you something unexpected like that, you can sort of reciprocate with a little, it's a touch of hospitality on your side to say, I appreciate your token. Here's a token from me. That's not, anything expensive, but something that means something. So that's the way I deal with that sometimes.
I think it also depends who the person is. I mean, it's not always a clear rule, never take anything from anybody. If you're in somebody's home and they want to give you tea or dinner or celebrate a birthday party, I think that's fine. If it's a communications officer from an NGO and they want to take you out to a fancy restaurant, that's a totally different thing. So I think it's usually pretty easy to figure out somebody's motives and why they're doing something for you. And if it's just a socially acceptable thing and they're being hospitable, I think it's okay to have, to engage with people socially. I mean, that's part of what we're doing is trying to learn about people and trying to build that relationship and get them to open up to us. It crosses a line if they're sort of trying to buy something from us,
So, thank you all. These are really powerful presentations, and I'm struck by the lack of consensus among you all, and I think certainly in journalism in general, about what these ethical red lines are, what the standards are, whether it's how you deal with an NGO, do you go with an NGO or not? I mean, what kind of image do you take? What kind of disclosure do you give? Permission from the people you're shooting? And then, especially for freelancers, because, in an era when there were a few dominant news outlets, they kind of set the standard for what professional ethics were. And now the environment is so fragmented, so many different outlets. And I think even the leading news outlets of the past they'll often go for the image that they might not have taken before. So I'm curious as to if you can think about, if any of you have thought about or could address, how do we go about achieving those kinds of standards? Any kind of consensus on that? I think this is also an issue that I think will come up again with some of the folks from the journalism schools who will be who are here with us today.
I could talk a little bit about this. I'm a freelancer, and I have had some kind of concerning experiences with editors who I do not think put as much thought into ethical issues as they should have. And I was actually really surprised. I've been doing a lot of reporting on these EDs for different publications, and never once did an editor raise concerns with me about images or names or anything. And I was the one pushing them. I was very paranoid, and I was bothering the photo editor and making sure, is this, can you see her face? Is the identity obscured enough? And it was tough to get a response, and I was hounding them. And it wasn't until actually I did like a radio segment with the BBC, and they were the first people who said to me, I have some questions about this, or do you think that we're putting anyone in danger by blah, 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 blah? And I was kind of shocked because it was the first time, and I had been doing articles for many different websites. No editor had brought this up. So I do think that there is much more of a responsibility on the journalist to be sure. Ultimately, your name is on it. You are responsible for it. No one's going to know that your editor was careless or that the publication, it's ultimately your fault if anything happens, if you put anyone's life in danger, etc. So it's a big responsibility, and I just think that it ultimately comes down to each person's judgment.
I'd also say there's a lot of different issues. Like some are about funding and bias and how that comes in, and other are just about things like danger and sort of personal doing quality journalism. I think in terms of bias and funding, a good rule is just transparency. At every step of the way, you're clear about, as Allison said, who's supporting you, where you're getting money from, where things are being published, and just at all steps in the process be transparent about how things happened, and then let the editor, the outlet, or the audience decide how they want to take it. It's a really hard thing because, the Pulitzer Center's existence is testament to the fact that it's really hard to do this kind of journalism, and more the kinds of people who are funding it are the kinds of people that can influence the way journalism is done. There's a huge difference, also as Allison said, between photojournalists and writers. There's not only is it okay for me to take money from an NGO and report on a similar issue, but sometimes it's celebrated. There's photojournalism festivals that give awards sponsored by NGOs, and editors don't care at all about publishing those pictures. Whereas if a writer got the same award from the same organization, they could never write about that issue for the same publication that would publish my pictures. There's a lot of responsibility on us, but there's only so much we can do. I think the public sort of expects when they go to an outlet, or if they're reading stories from an organization like the Pulitzer Center, they're putting trust in that organization, and they're expecting that that organization has done the requisite work to entrust the reporters or the photographers. But I think overall, and I know this is one of the things the Pulitzer Center sort of preaches as well, is just transparency at every step about what's happening, and then you let people make their own decision about how they want to accept or not accept the stories they were putting out.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask a question about this idea of getting a false sense of access from your subjects. In my experience working in India, a lot of the people that I had used for translation were all physicians, and I think part of that was because they're one of the few sort of people in the institution that could actually understand me and my accent. And also they had enough rapport with the patients to be able to sort of communicate with them, about their lives. But at the same time, I was thinking about the fact that the presence of a physician sort of commands a certain amount of deference from someone who is in a certain socioeconomic situation. And even though I tried to be very explicit about the fact that the patient had full autonomy about what they wanted to tell me and they could stop talking to me at any time, and a lot of things to sort of go over like who I am and what my purpose is, I still felt like I still wondered about whether or not what they were telling me was qualified by the fact that they were just essentially being confronted by two very socially privileged people. So I guess my question is like, how do you sort of navigate, who do you pick to translate for you, and how that might have an effect on communication with your subject?
I always work with a translator that will translate, and this is sort of weird, but I say, I don't want you to just translate the ideas. You have to say exactly what I say, and you have to tell me exactly what they're saying. Because the idea isn't that they're talking to the translator, it's that they're talking to me, and I need to know exactly what's happening. And I think if you rely on someone like a doctor or someone who works with the organization within which you're reporting, you can't really trust what's happening. They might actually be well-intentioned in trying to translate, but if you don't have complete control and you're not the one that's actually having a conversation with the person, then it's really hard to know why they're telling you anything. And especially in this scenario where you're in there with someone in a position of power, like there's so many times when I've known that a patient says, yeah, you can take my picture, but they really have no idea what I'm doing. And for all I know, like, not to sound patronizing, but they might think they really have to do whatever the doctor says because their care depends on it. If they don't, then who knows what's going to happen. So in those situations, I think you need to make sure that the translator is working for you, not working for anybody else, and that you are on the side of caution and just don't do something if you think it doesn't feel right.
Yeah, and I strongly agree. And I think, I've certainly been in countries where I've had different translators / fixers for every neighborhood I've gone to, partially because I want the person that knows that neighborhood, knows exactly what that issue is. But it's always somebody who is unaffiliated with the organization I'm working with. And that's tricky, right? Because especially in the health field, when you're like, you need somebody to understand the concepts you're talking about and the words you're saying, but not be affiliated with the organizations or the hospital or whatever. It can be really hard to find that person. And I have spent, that is probably what I spend the most time on before I go somewhere, is finding that person. So that's hard. One thing I do in the field, which I found to be useful, is I do video often. And what I found is that the translator I use in the field, translating my video, I use in the field, we get the interviews done. And then when I'm finished, either, before I leave the country or later, I'll find somebody in the US who can do this. I will have a different person transcribe that interview. And I do that for several reasons. Number one, to check the translation, but number two, to put a finer point on it, to check the ideas that are coming through, just to make sure that what that person's translating is exactly what that person, the original person, said. And I found that I caught some small, tweaks that have ultimately proved to be very important in my final reporting. So that's one little thing I did.
I was wondering how your experiences have been similar and different in situations where it's a government entity giving you access versus an NGO.
So I just came back from, I just came back from Cuba. And this is probably, I think the battery might have just died.
Okay, I've got one for you.
Okay. Oh wait, hello, okay. So I just came back from Cuba, which is probably a very extreme example of this, where we've been planning for this story for months. It was a story we had to go to the government for. We had to go to the government for because it was a story on the country's doctor training program. So it was something you couldn't access without the government. And it was one of the most bureaucratically frustrating situations I've ever been in. You know, you get there and there's a center that's called the CPI, the International Press Center, and their job is supposed to be to facilitate everything. And I think it's quite exactly the opposite. They just stall everything. So, in that situation, basically the way we set it up was the first half of the trip, we went to the CPI every day, sat there and tried to go through them. And the second half of the trip, we just went for broke and we just went around them with our fixer. And which we didn't want to do at the beginning because we don't want to piss them off and have everything shut down. But at the end, we're like, we have nothing to lose. We're just going to do it. And that worked. And we got what we needed. And, it was a tightrope because we'd go, talk to these hospital administrators. And by then we had enough, we'd ask the CPI for these letters of introduction and they gave them to us. And we also got a credential. That was helpful. So then we would eventually went to the, hospital directors themselves and said, here's our credential, here's our letter. And they'd be like, okay, great, let me make a phone call. And they would call and just verify that we were legit. And then we had access. And you just never know how that's going to work or if it's going to work. But so we basically had to go, that was the way we handled that. And who knows who we pissed off by doing that. And if I lived there, I might handle it differently. But because we were there for a very short amount of time, that's how we did it. So that's one example.
In that case, is there a consequence for the fixer? What happens after you leave?
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. We did not use our fixer for some of this. In some cases, she put us in touch with people and then we made the phone call to keep her out of the loop. In other cases, people went out on a limb for us and said, you can do this, but here's my limit. Here's how I do and don't want my name associated with this. And that's a very good point because you're leaving people behind who will have to deal with the consequences. Very important. So asking people, and we did ask this question on this trip, was like, what do you feel comfortable with and what do you not? And, how can we avoid getting you in trouble? And it's tricky. It's a tricky thing every time.
I had a question for you guys. So you all have issue areas that you report on that obviously guide the stories that you end up picking. But I just wanted to ask how you choose a story and how you know when you've found it.
So I'm really interested in public health, and the reason that I was interested in public health and started working on TV is because I liked the way that issues of health could get you into other issues of development in general in resource poor settings. That a health issue doesn't just impact somebody's health, but it impacts kind of their entire family and the trajectory of their family. So that's in general how I was interested in public health. And I think in terms of picking a story, I think photojournalists often aren't really good at it because we pick issues or topics and not stories. So we go out and we just say, we're gonna work on a project about TB in India. And an editor says, well, what's new about that? And we're like, well, I don't know, but it's a cool thing that it's gonna be good pictures that are gonna be really dramatic, so let's do that. So I think it's just thinking about, the normal things, what's new, what's happening that people would be interested in, how are things changing? A great question to ask that the Pulitzer Center works with the Solutions Journalism Network. And what they say is to ask the question, what are people doing that is working that other people aren't doing? So instead of just focusing on the problem, you think about how is this problem being solved in an innovative way? And I think that's a really useful way to think about it that sort of pulls you out of just focusing on damage and problems and death.
Yeah, I work for Retroport, and so we produce these news documentaries that look back at old news stories and then look at why they're still relevant and important today. And so that kind of helps shape, for my project at least, you're looking at this with kind of a historical eye and trying to figure out how the past is impacting the present, and so that leads you down a kind of a different path, but one that's really interesting and that it took a long time to kind of develop the idea behind my story, but yeah, it was fun to have it come together.
So in my piece, there are always news stories that are happening everywhere. They're giant stories. And I think that the key is finding a very small way to tell it, focusing on one thing and not the giant thing. So like, for example, everyone's writing about the global refugee crisis right now. This is a massive thing that's been happening for many, many years. How do you keep people interested in it? How do you make it relatable? And I think finding a small thing, which could be a person, or it could be like, for example, I was recently in Berlin and I found an organization that is starting a coding school, computer programming school for refugees. And I thought this was interesting because the topic that I was interested in and I wanted to communicate to people is this limbo, this waiting period. There are so many news stories about the celebration of actually making it to Europe. Yay, we finally made it, it's over. And actually it's not over. It's kind of dark actually. There's a really long and depressing waiting period before you're able to even begin to integrate. And I wanted to capture somehow, you know, how do you capture this realization that it's actually not over? And I thought that this refugee coding school is sort of interesting, and it's a way to tell it, because through this story I'm able to explain why they're doing this. They're doing this because there is empty time, and these people are looking to help integrate them and teach them a new skill perhaps that might help them find a job when they have the paperwork to actually start looking for a job or launch their own startup. So, and it might even get people who are more interested in technology and things like this, interested in reading about the refugee crisis. So I think it's about finding one small thing to tell a larger story.
Thanks. Excellent points of view. I just really want to say that really quick because totally appreciate this panel. It's been amazing. I was in Berlin during my project, and one problem that I came across as someone who's not a videographer, not a photographer, was how necessarily to navigate that intimacy with your subject and how to gain that trust so that you can take their picture, so that you can record their story. I think I did it pretty simply. I just asked people if I could take their picture, but I was dealing with the Turkish community in Berlin, which is private, and German culture in general is very private in terms of publication. So I was just wondering if any of you had sort of rules for navigating that privacy, that intimacy with your subjects, and if that sort of changed per the culture that you're in.
I think David made this point earlier, but I think in that kind of case, when you have a limited amount of time, I think going in with somebody who people trust is vital, right? And that can be an NGO, that can be an organization that they're already working with, that already trusts them and says, here's a journalist that we vetted, somebody we trust, and they're already in a setting, or you have made arrangements ahead of time to have a meeting with them, you know, through the NGO when you explain what you're doing. I think that sometimes is the only way to make connections in a short period of time.
I'd also say one thing that always happens, especially if pictures aren't your main focus, you know, you'll go and you'll start talking to somebody, you interview them, and then it's over, and it's time for pictures, and they say, okay, what do you want me to do? Or you think, okay, well, what are we gonna do now? How do we do this? And I mean, the real answer is just time. If you have limited time, there's only so much you can do, and you have to be aware of what you can achieve in that amount of time. One way to get pictures that aren't just people sitting around or aren't just portraits is not only to go in with somebody that they trust, but to go in when something is happening, you know, where it's not just them sitting around wondering what they should be doing for you. But if they're, you know, in public health, if a healthcare worker is going to their home to give them medicine, then you can sort of go one day, meet them, tell them what you're doing, get permission, go back the next day when the thing is actually happening and take pictures. So it's not this uncomfortable thing, and you don't necessarily have to spend a day getting to know them and sort of see their daily life. And I think that that's valid for, you know, education or any other issue. Sort of figure out what is truly happening and separate the image making from the time you're spending just talking to somebody.
Yeah.
More questions?
This might be a controversial question, but I was wondering if there is any time when it's okay to obscure the fact that you're a journalist in order to get access to a place, whether that's like to an authority or bureaucracy, or I.
Did you have a situation like that?
Kind of. The village office where I worked in a tribe in northern Tanzania, and they'd been scorned by journalists before who came in and took pictures of inappropriate things and like really, I don't know, like made the image of the village to. Anyway, so they were a bit wary of journalists, and so I had to play up the fact that I was a student and that I had done research in the area before. So I really relied on like my previous experience and my previous reputation. And then it was like, I'm gonna go continue this, but I'm gonna publish it. There are people who look at this, but I never like, I don't know. I told them I was working at the Pulitzer Center and that it was published, but I don't think I used the word journalist because it seemed to have like a negative connotation.
I would say, unless it's concerning like our safety, that the one golden rule is to always be open and honest about who you are and what you're doing. And we have to accept the consequences of people who have come before us. We have to set a good example for people who come next. And we have to be okay if people aren't willing to participate with us because we're journalists. I say that 95% of my job is getting to the point where I can take a picture and 5% is actually taking the picture. And that 95% is sort of convincing people that even though I'm a journalist, there's a reason for you to collaborate with what I'm doing. And that's sort of the one thing that I think isn't really a gray space. Like, I always have to be open and honest with people. I'm a journalist, this is what I'm doing. And you can do all the things that you say, you know, explain how you're different from other journalists who have come before, how the work you're doing is different. But in my opinion, I don't feel comfortable obscuring the fact that I'm a journalist.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all about, I mean, that's why we're there. Sorry, I'm sitting. And I think not being honest about that is not good for the story, not good for your relationship with your subject, and not good for future journalists to coming in. Because it is, yeah, you're working off people who came before you and people will be coming in after.
I'll just add that it does happen a lot in the field, and you'll see, like, I know that a lot of the big stories like ISIS artifacts, for example, there are people who are pretending to be potential buyers to be able to actually see the artifacts, and there are people who are doing undercover stuff to you know, find smugglers, and I agree with what everyone is saying, that that's a problem and it does make it more difficult for other journalists to come after, but you have to sort of stick to your guns and do the right thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with everybody else. I was in a weird situation, maybe Sarah, you had this too, in a place like Bihar. And also it happened to me in Western Nepal where I went into communities that were so remote that people didn't know what a journalist was. And that was an awkward thing because people seemed to be open to the camera, but they didn't understand that these pictures were then going to be very public. And so the burden really was on me to explain, these pictures will be very public, and are you okay with that? And it was a burden, right? Having to explain, like, you know, are you sure you want to do this? When really it was against my interest to try to push that. But I ended up like on this document that was like a photo video release kind of thing, and I had it translated into Hindi. And then we were in communities where people didn't read, so I actually had my translator read it to people and just had this like half an hour long conversation with people about what I was doing before I would take a single frame in their homes. And that added just a whole nother layer of interestingness to the situation.
I'd also say that even from 5 years ago, everything we do is accessible now. So when something that happens to me a lot is I'll be talking to somebody and there's issues of privacy. You know, they don't want the community to know they have TB. They don't want the community to know they have HIV. I'm with an NGO that they trust, and they think, well, he's with the NGO and he's from the United States. These pictures are only going to be in the United States, so I guess it's okay. And you sort of understand that they do have issues with privacy, and there is stigma with the issue you're dealing with. So you sort of have to go further and say, well, there is a chance that this is going to be in your community. People you know are going to see this. Is that okay? And you just sort of have to keep going and keep going. I get weird emails all the time of people who have seen my pictures that I would never expect to see my pictures. I get, a few months ago, I was in Jordan working on a project about Syrian refugees in Jordan. And there was a little girl in a family, she was like 7 years old. And like a week after I left, she Facebook friended me. And so it's just like everything comes around. Whatever we don't say, there's a chance that, aside from if it's right or wrong, there's a chance that people are going to find out what we're actually doing. And I think it's just better to start with honesty and with being very clear about what we're doing, because you never know what's going to come around.
Question back here. I have a quick question. When you guys are, I'll just come your way. Okay. When you guys are out reporting and you end up with a subject or someone, have you ever been asked for money for access by a family? And what do you tell them? I've sort of done reporting with the Pulitzer Center for like a while, and especially when you go to very remote countries, you go to Nepal or you go to like Afghanistan, meet families. They understand you're a journalist, but they also want money for the for the access they're providing. What do you do?
I could ask for money all the time. A different thing people wonder is, how am I going to benefit from this? Not necessarily, are you going to give me money, but if I participate, is the NGO going to give me, better access to medicine? Is somebody going to build a clinic here? And I think it's the same thing that we've all been saying. What I tell them is, I'm not going to give you money. I'm a journalist. My role is not to help you. However much I hope that this story will help you, and on a macro level, I believe in the power of journalism to affect change. Your life is going to be exactly the same after I leave. I'm not going to give you anything. Nobody's going to give you anything. I think it's a good thing what we're trying to do, and I hope you'll participate. And pretty much they always agree. But I think, again, it's just being very clear about who we are and what we're doing.
I also, I agree with what you said. And I've also found, though, that if it's possible, sometimes if you can give somebody, if you've taken their photo, bring a photo back to them. That you took of them or their family, I found they appreciate that so much. And it's just something little you can give back.
I'll also just say that sometimes I do give people money because I like them and I want to help them, and we're all humans and we're dealing with these really difficult issues, and there's people in need, and $1 can mean the difference to them. And people can decide not to run those pictures if they want. Sometimes I'll decide to help somebody and not use them in the story. But it's not, I think people are they try and be very precise. You never do anything. Don't let somebody even use your cell phone, because that would change, what happens with the story. I can't do things like that. And if people don't want to use my work because of it, then that's sort of fine with me.
This is right along those lines, but as far as, I have a lot of people who I spoke with, wonderful people, really got to know well, in reporting, and then afterwards it was, oh, send me these photos. Oh, I'm going to add you on Facebook. Let me follow you on Twitter. Let me, I'm going to email you and all this kind of stuff. And I was just wondering, as far as with your subjects after that, because I'm never really sure how to handle that, because they are lovely, wonderful people, and I'd love to keep in contact. And always with will you send me the story? I say, once it's over, once it's published, and I'll send it. But I was just wondering if you guys have had similar situations, which sounds like you have.
Yeah, I think that's why some people have their public Facebook pages. I don't. But I do, I definitely have a policy of accepting friendships from people once the story's out. Then I will send them pictures or links or whatever, and then I will Facebook friend them. I tend to not Facebook friend them, accept the request until the story's out. I don't know why. That seems like a line for me, though, personally. But yeah, I'm in touch with all kinds of people who I've done stories on, and personally.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it could be a nice thing. Like I've actually become friends with some people that were either subjects or their family members were subjects in my story, and we connected over Facebook, and now they're great and they've helped me get more stories. So it could be to your benefit that they can chat you one day and be like, did you see what happened? Or I have some really interesting thing for you. And and you could sort of stay in touch and make sure that you don't lose track of the story. So it can actually be quite a nice thing.
I'll also say one way I deal with wanting to be a nice person and giving people pictures and sending them stories, but balancing that with the sheer number of people that we come into contact with, is I'll say, that's great if you send me an email, I'll respond with a picture. And I would say like 90% of them never send me an email, but I don't feel like it's my responsibility to send every single person I take a picture of them, but I'd like to do it. And if they care about it enough to send me an email, then I'm happy to respond.
I'll also say one thing, that is, I try to stay in touch with my fixers too, for the same reasons that Emily just said, but also because there are a lot of journalists moving around this world, and if you can connect them with the fixer you used, if you liked your fixer and you're still in touch, Facebook is a great way to stay in touch with those people. It's just karma, and I found that stuff always comes back, right? If you can connect that out, it always circles back around. And people, you're helping somebody maintain their livelihood, right? So that's just.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has any. Otherwise, we will go.
Thank you all so much for coming. This has been great. So it seems like all of your kind of ethical codes have been built off personal experience, and you're talking about what is okay and where that line is, and it's slightly different for every person. I'm kind of wondering if you've ever made, whether there's one that stands out, an ethical mistake that has helped guide your future principles, because I think that, I've certainly messed up in the field. I think that we all do.
Sure, to let it get past.
One of the reasons why I wanted to put up some of these pictures while I was talking, because there's tons of pictures where when I still look at them, I'm like, how could I possibly have taken that picture? Like, how is it okay to have done that? Two things that I always remember are, one time I was meeting a mother and her daughter who had HIV, and I was talking to them about trying to take pictures of them. I remember thinking in my head, what do I have to tell this woman to get her to let me take pictures of her daughter? I was like, that's just not the right way to think about things. And another instance that I always sort of think about is, you're taking a picture of somebody and they're smiling, and you think, I don't want them smiling, they're supposed to be sad in this picture. So I think it just all comes back to, I know it's not a great answer, but it all comes back to just being like a nice person and respecting people and thinking about what a good way to treat people is.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's one that always stands out in my mind, because it was literally one of my first days on my first photo internship out of college. I was shooting this like an indigenous ceremony in Washington State, and I had this great conversation with one of the leaders of the organization, and he came up to me after and he gave me a drum, one of the drums that they had used, and I took it and I didn't even think anything about it. And then by the time I got back to my car, I was like, oh my God, I can't take this. This is really not okay. And so I ran back, I couldn't find him, but I ended up giving it to his son. And, but I don't know, that always just stands out to me. Don't take anything from anybody and be very careful about it. But yeah, it all boils down to being a good person, I think. So.
Thank you. You have all given us a little bit of thought, and I really appreciated you sharing all of these really funny stories with us.